Harlem, 1965. A new gang publicly humiliated Bumpy Johnson 3 times in 30 days, stole his territory, sent funeral flowers to his table, and sat in his chair in front of the entire underworld. Bumpy Johnson was 60 years old, and for 7 days he did absolutely nothing. No threats, no meetings, no warnings. What did Bumpy Johnson do in those 7 days that made an entire gang vanish from Harlem without a single confrontation? To understand how it all led here, we go back to where it truly began. Harlem, March 1965. The neighborhood had seen many things in its long and complicated history: gang wars that reshaped entire blocks overnight, power transitions that happened without warning or explanation, men who built empires from nothing and lost everything in a single afternoon. Harlem had seen ambition and greed and courage and cowardice in equal measure, had absorbed all of it, had continued breathing through all of it, the way a city absorbs weather. But what happened on the morning of March 4th, 1965, was something Harlem had never seen before. Something that stopped conversations mid-sentence on street corners, that made shopkeepers step outside their doors and stare, that made old men who had lived on 125th Street for 30 years shake their heads slowly and say, quietly and with absolute certainty, that whoever had done this did not understand what they had done. Someone had put up posters, not printed posters, not professional announcements, not the kind of organized campaign that suggested resources and planning behind it. These were handwritten, produced on plain white paper in heavy black ink, and they had been placed on every lamppost along the entire length of 125th Street, the commercial and symbolic spine of Harlem, the street where deals were made and reputations were established, and the invisible architecture of power was maintained through decades of careful negotiation. Approximately 40 posters in total, according to residents who counted them that morning, spaced at regular intervals from Lenox Avenue all the way to Fifth Avenue, covering 16 city blocks. Each poster contained a single line of text, written in large block letters that were clearly legible from 10 feet away. The text read, "Bumpy Johnson, your time is over." No signature, no address, no explanation of who had written the words or what they intended by them. Only a drawing at the bottom of each poster, a cobra, rendered in careful detail, hood spread wide, head raised in the posture of a snake preparing to strike. The first person to notice the posters, according to neighborhood accounts collected by Harlem community organizer James Whitfield in a 1968 oral history project, was a sanitation worker named Cornelius Brown, 51 years old, who had been on his morning route since 4 in the morning and who came upon the first poster at approximately 6:15 in the morning near the corner of 125th and Lenox. Brown later told Whitfield that he stopped his cart, read the poster twice, looked up and down the street and saw the identical posters stretching in both directions as far as he could see, and felt, in his own words, like something in the air had changed, like the temperature had dropped even though it hadn't, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Brown did not remove the poster. He continued his route, and by the time the first shopkeepers began arriving to open their establishments at 7 in the morning, the posters had already been seen by dozens of early riser, and word was spreading through Harlem the way word always spread in Harlem, rapidly, through networks of conversation and connection that operated faster and more efficiently than any telephone system. By 8 in the morning, every significant figure in Harlem's underground economy knew about the posters. By 9, the phones had begun ringing in apartments and back offices and private social clubs across the neighborhood, as men who had spent years carefully cultivating relationships with Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson called each other to confirm what they had heard and to ask, with varying degrees of anxiety and disbelief, whether anyone had spoken to Johnson yet, and whether anyone understood what this meant, And most importantly, whether anyone knew who had done it, because putting up those posters was not simply a provocative act. It was a declaration of war delivered in the most public manner imaginable, on the most visible street in Harlem, against a man who had controlled the neighborhood's criminal infrastructure for more than 3 decades. It was the equivalent of walking into the most respected church in a community, that in spray-painting obscenities on the altar. It was not just disrespectful. It was an act designed to force a response, to put Bumpy Johnson in a position where silence would be interpreted as weakness and response would be interpreted as desperation, where every possible reaction carried a cost, where the very act of being forced to react at all represented a diminishment of the authority that Johnson had spent a lifetime building. Whoever had done this understood power. That much was clear from the posters themselves, from the precision of their placement, from the calculated nature of the provocation. What was not yet clear? On the morning of March 4th, 1965, was whether whoever had done this understood the specific nature of the power they were challenging. That understanding would come later, and it would not come cheaply. The man responsible for the posters was not unknown to Harlem, though he was not yet well known either, which was, as events would demonstrate, precisely the condition he had spent 18 months carefully cultivating. Raymond Denton, known throughout the northeastern underworld by the name Razor, was 34 years old in March 1965, a lean and composed man of medium height who dressed in conservative suits and spoke with the measured precision of someone accustomed to choosing words with the same care a surgeon chooses instruments. He had been born in Baltimore, raised in Washington, D.C., and had spent 7 years in the United States Army, where he had served in military intelligence, reaching the rank of captain before his honorable discharge in 1961. His commanding officers, according to military records reviewed by federal investigators in 1966, had described him consistently as exceptionally intelligent, strategically sophisticated, and possessed of what one colonel called an almost unsettling capacity for patience in situations where less disciplined officers would act prematurely. Denton had read Machiavelli at 18. By 30, he had read it 4 times, each reading producing a different set of marginal annotations in the copy he kept on his desk. He had also read Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and a biography of Meyer Lansky that he considered, privately, to be more practically instructive than anything taught in his military intelligence training. He was not a man who acted on impulse. He was not a man who confused boldness with recklessness, or who mistook aggression for strategy. He was in the most precise sense of the term. A planner, someone who measured outcomes before initiating actions, who mapped the terrain of a situation before moving through it, who identified the pressure points of a system before applying pressure. And for 18 months before the morning of March 4th, 1965, Raymond Denton had been studying Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson with the focused and systematic attention of an intelligence analyst preparing a target assessment. The research had been thorough. Denton had documented Johnson's territories, the gambling operations, the numbers running networks, the informal systems of taxation and protection that had made Johnson the most significant economic force in Harlem's underground economy for more than 3 decades. He had mapped Johnson's relationships, the Italian families who supplied certain goods and who maintained a carefully negotiated peace with Johnson, the police officials who received regular payments, the community figures and political contacts who provided legitimacy and intelligence. He had documented Johnson's routines, the restaurant on 7th Avenue where Johnson ate breakfast most mornings, the barbershop on 116th Street where Johnson spent Thursday afternoons, the social clubs and meeting places where Johnson conducted the informal business that kept his operation functioning. He had assessed Johnson's physical condition, 60 years old in 1965, a man who had spent portions of the past 15 years in federal prison, who moved more slowly than he once had, who by any objective measure was past the physical prime that had made him formidable in earlier decades. And from all of this research, Raymond Denton had reached a conclusion that he believed was supported by evidence and logic in equal measure. Bumpy Johnson, Denton concluded, was a legend. And legends, in his assessment, were by definition more historical than present, more memory than reality, more symbol than substance. The man had been dominant. The man had been genuinely dangerous. But that man existed in the past. And the past, however impressive, could not protect against a sufficiently well-planned and executed challenge in the present. This conclusion was the most consequential error of Raymond Denton's life. But on the morning of March 4th, 1965, standing in his office on 131st Street and looking at the telephone that had not yet rung with any word from Bumpy Johnson or anyone representing him, Denton did not yet know it was an error. He believed it was an insight. He believed it was the kind of clear-eyed assessment that his intelligence training had equipped him to make. The kind of conclusion that separated sophisticated strategic thinking from the emotional and reactive decision-making that characterized most men in the underground world. He believed he had seen something that others had missed. He believed he had correctly identified a vulnerability that others had been too intimidated or too sentimental to recognize. He was wrong, but the nature of his wrongness would not become fully apparent for another 7 days. The posters were only the first of 3 provocations that Denton had designed. Each one carefully calibrated to build upon the last. Each one intended to communicate a specific message to a specific audience, while simultaneously forcing Bumpy Johnson into an increasingly untenable position. Denton thought of these 3 actions the way a chess player thinks of an opening sequence, not as isolated moves but as an integrated structure. Each move creating the conditions for the next, the whole more significant than any individual part. The second provocation occurred on March 7th, 3 days after the posters appeared. On the occasion of Bumpy Johnson's 60th birthday, Johnson's gambling operation at 125th Street, not the largest in his network, but the most symbolically significant. Operating from a location he had controlled since 1948, opened that morning to find the locks changed, the staff replaced, and a young man in a tailored suit sitting behind what had been Johnson's desk, collecting what had been Johnson's revenue. The operation had been transferred to Denton's control through a combination of financial pressure and carefully targeted persuasion applied to the 3 individuals who managed the day-to-day logistics of the location, none of whom had been given the opportunity to consult with Johnson before making their decisions. The timing was not accidental. Denton had chosen Johnson's birthday deliberately, understanding that the symbolic dimension of the act would amplify its impact. That losing a territory on the day you turned 60 carried a meaning that losing the same territory on any other day would not. 3 days after that, on March 10th, a delivery arrived at the restaurant on 7th Avenue where Johnson ate breakfast most mornings. The delivery was a bouquet of funeral flowers, white lilies, and chrysanthemums, the traditional arrangement for a wake accompanied by a small card on which was written, in the same block lettering as the posters, "Rest now. Old man. You've earned it." The restaurant owner, a man named Theodore Patterson, who had known Johnson for 20 years and who received the delivery before Johnson arrived that morning, later told a close associate that holding the arrangement felt like holding something genuinely dangerous. Like the flowers themselves were a form of threat that he did not fully understand but could feel with complete clarity. The third provocation was the most audacious, the one that Denton himself considered the centerpiece of his opening sequence, the move that would make the strategic message impossible to misread. On the evening of March 14th, at the Apollo Theater on 125th Street, during a performance that had drawn most of Harlem's significant underground figures to a single room, the kind of gathering that happened perhaps twice a year, and that functioned as an informal summit of the neighborhood's power structure. Raymond Denton walked through the main entrance, crossed the lobby, entered the auditorium, and sat down in the seat that everyone in that room knew belonged, by long-standing custom and universal acknowledgement, to Bumpy Johnson. The seat was in the third row, slightly left of center, with a clear sightline to the stage and an equally clear sightline from most other seats in the auditorium. Johnson was not present that evening, but the significance of the seat had nothing to do with Johnson's physical presence. It had to do with what occupying that seat, in that room, in front of those witnesses, communicated about who Denton believed himself to be and who he believed Johnson to no longer be. The room saw it. Every person in that auditorium understood what they were watching, and not one of them said anything. What followed those three provocations was something that Harlem had not experienced in living memory, a period of sustained and complete silence from the man who had been challenged. Johnson's associates waited for instructions that did not come. His lieutenants, men who had spent years executing Johnson's decisions with efficiency and loyalty, found themselves receiving no decisions to execute. His allies among the neighborhood's established figures called and received either no answer or briefing, deflecting responses that conveyed nothing about Johnson's intentions. The neighborhood itself seemed to expand with the pressure of the unanswered question. Conversations on street corners and in barbershops and in the back rooms of social clubs returning again and again to the same central mystery: what was Bumpy Johnson doing? And when was he going to do it? Marcus Webb, a 43-year-old numbers runner who had worked within Johnson's organization for 11 years and who later spoke with journalist David Halberstam in 1969, described the atmosphere during those days with a precision that stayed with everyone who heard it. "We were ready," Webb said. "Every one of us was ready to move the moment Bumpy gave the word." The disrespect had been public. The challenge had been public. In our world, that required a public answer, and it required it fast. Because every day that passed without a response was a day that someone somewhere was drawing a conclusion about what the silence meant. And we all knew what conclusion they were drawing. We just couldn't understand why Bumpy wasn't stopping them from drawing it. Webb paused in Halberstam's account before adding, "But Bumpy had been in this business since before most of us were born. And the one thing you learn, if you watch him long enough, is that when Bumpy Johnson goes quiet, it is never because he has nothing to say." Johnson's daily routine during this period, according to multiple witnesses, showed no visible sign of disruption or disturbance. He ate breakfast at his usual restaurant, though he had been informed about the funeral flowers and had simply nodded and requested that Patterson donate the arrangement to a nearby church. He read the newspaper each morning with what people who saw him described as genuine interest, rather than the distracted performance of a man trying to project calm. He did not feel. He walked in the afternoons, sometimes alone and sometimes with one or two longtime associates, covering the same routes through Harlem that he had walked for decades, stopping to speak with shopkeepers and residents and community figures with the unhurried ease of a man whose schedule contained no urgency. He did not appear angry. He did not appear afraid. He appeared, to everyone who observed him during those days, to be precisely what he had always been: a man who moved through the world at his own pace, according to his own calculations, on a timeline that he alone determined. The climax of Denton's opening campaign came on the evening of March 17th, 13 days after the posters had appeared on 125th Street. Denton had spent 2 weeks making calls, visiting the right people, applying the right combination of persuasion and implied pressure. And by March 17th he had assembled in the private dining room of La Maison, the most expensive restaurant in Harlem. 41 of the neighborhood's most significant underground figures, men who controlled territories, managed operations, supplied goods and services, and collectively represented the connective tissue of the criminal economy that made Harlem function below the surface of its visible life. These were not small figures. These were men whose opinions mattered, whose allegiances shaped the balance of power, whose presence in a room meant something about the legitimacy of what was being discussed in that room. Denton had reserved the entire restaurant. He had ordered food and wine for everyone. He had arranged the seating so that he occupied the position at the head of the long central table that, in every gathering of this kind that anyone present could remember, had been occupied by Bumpy Johnson. The symbolism was unmistakable. The message was unmistakable. And when the room had settled, and the initial conversations had subsided, and 41 pairs of eyes were watching him with the particular attention that powerful men give to moments they sense are significant, Raymond Denton reached into the leather case beside his chair, removed an hourglass approximately 10 inches tall, and placed it in the center of the table where everyone could see it. The sand had already begun to fall. "Gentlemen," Denton said, his voice carrying the even, unhurried confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times without making it sound rehearsed. "Harlem is a neighborhood that respects strength. It has always respected strength. It built itself on strength. Every man in this room is here because he has demonstrated strength in one form or another, and because the people around him recognized that strength and responded to it." He paused, allowing the room to absorb the statement before continuing. "For 30 years, this neighborhood has organized itself around one man's strength. I am not here to diminish what that man built. I am here to ask a simple question that I believe Harlem deserves to have answered." He touched the hourglass lightly with 2 fingers. "I am giving Bumpy Johnson 7 days to respond to what has happened in this neighborhood over the past 2 weeks. 7 days to make his position clear. 7 days to demonstrate that the strength this room has organized itself around for 30 years still exists." Another pause. Shorter this time. The kind that precedes the sentence everyone in the room already knows is coming. If he does not respond in 7 days, then this room will understand what that silence means, and this room will act accordingly. 41 men sat in that dining room, and not one of them spoke. Not one of them challenged the premise. Not one of them stood up and said that the man being discussed had forgotten more about power and survival than everyone in that room had ever learned. The silence was not agreement, necessarily, but in a world where silence and agreement were functionally indistinguishable from each other, the distinction did not matter. The hourglass sat in the center of the table, sand falling through its narrow throat with the patient, mechanical indifference of time itself, and Denton watched the room and believed that what he was seeing was the future taking shape. He was not entirely wrong about that. He was only wrong about which future it was. That night, long after the restaurant had emptied and the streets of Harlem had gone quiet, the light came on in the study of Bumpy Johnson's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. It was past 2 in the morning. The neighborhood below was still. Johnson sat at his desk, the same desk where, over 3 decades, he had made decisions that shaped the lives of thousands of people and the character of an entire community, and he opened a leather notebook to a clean page. He did not write a letter. He did not draft a plan of response in the way that most men in his position would have, with logistics and timelines and assignments of personnel to specific tasks. He simply began writing names, 17 names, written in the careful, unhurried script of a man who had all the time in the world. Because he understood something that Raymond Denton, for all his intelligence and all his preparation and all his careful study of the past 18 months, had not yet understood at all. The battle had not started 2 weeks ago, when the posters went up. It had not started that evening, when the hourglass was placed on the table. It had started the moment Denton made his first phone call to his first potential ally. And in that moment, without knowing it, without any awareness of what he was doing, Raymond Denton had begun to lose. The 17 names that Bumpy Johnson wrote in his leather notebook that night were not the names of enemies. They were not the names of men he intended to threaten, or intimidate, or remove from the situation by force. They were in the precise and deliberate assessment of a man who had spent 30 years learning how power actually functioned beneath the surface of visible action. The names of the 17 people whose continued cooperation made Raymond Denton's operation possible, the load-bearing columns of a structure that looked solid from the outside, but that would collapse with the removal of the right supports, applied in the right sequence, at the right moment. A wholesale supplier named Albert Cruz, 58 years old, who moved goods through a warehouse on the west side of Manhattan and who had been providing certain materials to the Cobras for 4 months. A protection broker named Samuel Iron, who maintained relationships with 6 police precincts across Upper Manhattan and whose goodwill was the reason Denton's operations had not yet attracted the kind of official attention that would have made them impossible to sustain. An underground accountant named Victor Lowe, 44 years old, who managed the financial architecture of 3 separate Cobra revenue streams and whose discretion and competence had been essential to the organization's rapid growth. 14 others, each one occupying a specific and irreplaceable function in the ecosystem that Denton had built over 18 months, each one holding a thread without which some portion of that ecosystem would begin to unravel. What every one of those 17 people had in common, and what Raymond Denton had not known when he selected them, and would not know until it was too late to matter, was that every single one of them had a history with Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson that predated their relationship with the Cobras. Not a history of fear, necessarily, though fear played its role in some cases. A history of obligation. Albert Cruz had been given his warehouse location through an introduction that Johnson had arranged in 1958 when Cruz was starting over after a bankruptcy that had destroyed his previous business. Samuel Irons had been helped out of a legal situation in 1961 that would have ended his career and his freedom, through the intervention of a lawyer whose fees Johnson had quietly paid. Victor Lowe's daughter had received a scholarship to a nursing school in Philadelphia in 1963, funded through a community organization that Johnson had established and personally capitalized. The other 14 carried similar debts, smaller in some cases, larger in others, but real in every case. The kind of debts that exist not as formal obligations, but as the moral weight of remembered kindness. The kind that cannot be discharged by simply walking away. Johnson did not call any of these people. He did not send messages or intermediaries or any form of communication that could be documented or observed or reported back to Denton. Beginning on the morning of March 18th, the day after the dinner at La Maison, Johnson simply began visiting them, one at a time, in person, unannounced, arriving at their homes or their places of business in the unhurried manner of a man making social calls on a pleasant spring morning. He would sit down, accept whatever was offered: tea, coffee, a glass of water, and talk about ordinary things. He asked Albert Cruz about his wife, who had been ill, and listened carefully to the answer. He asked Samuel Irons about his son, who was in his 2nd year of college in Connecticut, and nodded with genuine interest at the progress report. He asked Victor Lowe about his daughter, now a working nurse in Philadelphia, and smiled when Lowe described her recent promotion. And then, in each case, after perhaps 20 or 30 minutes of conversation about families and health and the ordinary texture of life, Johnson would stand up, shake hands warmly, and leave. He said nothing about Denton. He said nothing about the Cobras. He said nothing about what he wanted or expected or required. He simply visited, and left, and moved on to the next name on his list. He completed all 17 visits in 4 days, and then he went home and waited. The results began to manifest on the 3rd day after the dinner at La Maison, with a precision and a completeness that, even to the people who had known Johnson longest and understood his methods best, carried a quality of inevitability that was almost unsettling to witness. On the morning of March 20th, Albert Cruz called Denton's logistics manager and reported, with professional regret and a detailed technical explanation, that sounded entirely plausible. That there had been a significant disruption in his supply chain that would prevent him from fulfilling his current commitments for an indefinite period. The explanation mentioned port delays and customs complications, and a problem with a shipping contractor that Cruz said he was working to resolve. The explanation was thorough, calm, and completely fabricated. Cruz had no supply chain problem. He had simply decided, after a 30-minute conversation over tea with a man he had known for 7 years and to whom he owed more than he could easily repay, that his future did not lie in the direction of Raymond Denton. The following morning, Denton attempted to reach 2 of the smaller territorial operators who had attended the dinner at La Maison and who had, at that dinner, given every indication of moving toward an alliance with the Cobras. Both men's phones rang without answer. Both men were, at that precise moment, having their own private conversations with their own histories, conversations that had been set in motion by Johnson's quiet visits, and that were now producing their own quiet conclusions. By the afternoon of the same day, both men had reached those conclusions independently of each other, and both had made calls to members of Johnson's organization that made their positions clear in the understated but unambiguous language that the underground world used for such communications. Then, on March 22nd, the 5th day after the La Maison dinner, something happened that went beyond the quiet architectural dismantling that Johnson had been conducting and entered the territory of the genuinely unexpected. Victor Lowe, the Cobra's accountant, walked into the offices of the Manhattan District Attorney carrying 3 folders of financial records and a willingness to discuss their contents that his attorney later described as entirely voluntary and entirely his own decision. Lowe did not implicate Johnson in anything. He did not claim coercion or pressure. He simply decided, for reasons he never fully explained to anyone, that the professional relationship he had entered into with the Cobras was one he wished to exit, and that the most complete exit available to him involved a conversation with prosecutors. The information Lowe provided did not immediately result in arrests, but it created a documentary trail that would follow Denton's organization with the patient persistence of a shadow for months afterward. Denton heard about the supply disruption and called 3 alternative suppliers, 2 of whom had connections to people on Johnson's list that Denton did not know about, and one of whom was simply unavailable. He heard about the 2 operators going silent and sent personal emissaries to both, receiving responses that were polite, vague, and communicated nothing actionable. He heard about Lowe and sat in his office for a long time without speaking, running the sequence of events through the analytical framework that his intelligence training had given him, looking for the pattern, trying to identify the mechanism, trying to find the name or the action or the specific intervention that was producing these results. He could not find it. He could not find it because there was no single intervention to find, no specific action that could be identified and countered and neutralized. What Johnson had done was not an attack. It was a withdrawal of a kind of support so ambient, so woven into the fabric of the environment, that its absence registered not as the result of an action, but as a change in conditions, the way a drop in temperature registers not as something that happened, but as something that simply is. Denton did not see Bumpy Johnson during any of this. He did not hear Johnson's name connected to any of it. He did not receive a single message or warning or communication of any kind from Johnson or anyone representing him. The 7-day deadline that Denton had set at La Maison passed on March 24th without a word from Johnson, which should have been a victory, which should have been confirmation of everything Denton had argued that night, that silence meant surrender, that the absence of response meant the absence of power. Instead, the passing of the deadline felt, to Denton and to the diminishing circle of people around him, like walking through a door and discovering that the room on the other side was not the room you had expected. The coronation party was scheduled for the evening of March 24th, the precise moment of Denton's self-imposed deadline, at the gambling location on 125th Street that the Cobras had taken from Johnson 3 weeks earlier. Denton had planned it meticulously, 60 invited guests, a live jazz quartet hired from a club in Midtown, food catered from a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan whose discretion could be relied upon, flowers arranged throughout the space in a manner that communicated celebration and permanence and the confident ease of power, fully assumed. He had prepared remarks. He had thought carefully about what he would say and how he would say it. The language of transition and legitimacy and forward momentum that would consolidate, in one evening, the narrative that the previous 3 weeks had been building toward. The caterers arrived at 6 in the evening. The musicians arrived at 7. The flowers were arranged. The tables were set. The food was prepared. The wine was opened and breathing in the way that the man who arranged such things had assured Denton it should be opened and breathing. The candles were lit at 8 in the evening, when the first guests were expected to begin arriving, their light falling across white tablecloths and polished glasses with the warm and flattering quality that Denton had envisioned when he planned the evening. At 9 in the evening, not one guest had arrived. At 10, the musicians, having played through their first set to an empty room, looked at each other and then at Denton's lieutenant with a question in their faces that the lieutenant could not answer. At 11, the caterers began, with professional and apologetic efficiency, to pack the food that had not been served. At midnight, the candles had burned down by half and the room retained the eerie quality of a celebration, from which all the people had been removed, while the objects of celebration remained, the glasses still full, the flowers still fresh, the table still set with the precision of an event that had been prepared for with great care and that no one had attended. On the table at the center of the room, where Denton had planned to stand when he addressed his guests, there was a single object that none of his staff could account for, that no one had seen placed there, that appeared to have arrived by means that no one present could explain. It was a black and white photograph, approximately 8 inches by 10, in a plain cardboard frame. The photograph showed a younger Ellsworth Johnson standing on 125th Street in the autumn of 1935, the year he had first consolidated control of Harlem's numbers operation, looking directly at the camera with the expression of a man who had already decided every important question and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. There was no note with the photograph. There was no message of any kind. There did not need to be. Denton stood in that empty room for a long time after his staff had quietly withdrawn, looking at the photograph on the table and understanding, for the first time with complete clarity, that what he had interpreted as Johnson's silence had not been silence at all. It had been language. It had been the most complete and devastating form of communication available to a man of Johnson's experience and capability, the language of a person who does not need to announce his power because his power is already present in every room he has ever occupied, visible to anyone who knows how to read the room correctly. In the weeks that followed, the Cobras did not collapse dramatically. They did not end in a confrontation, or a crisis, or a single decisive event that could be pointed to as the moment of failure. They simply stopped being viable. The way a fire stops being viable when the oxygen is gradually removed, not in an explosion but in a slow diminishment, each day slightly less than the day before, until one morning the thing that had been burning is simply no longer burning, and the space it occupied is cold and quiet. Members left in ones and twos, some to other organizations, some to legitimate employment, some to conversations with law enforcement that their lawyers later helped them navigate. The supply networks that Denton had spent 18 months building went quiet or redirected themselves toward other clients. The territorial footholds that the Cobras had established across Harlem were absorbed back into the existing power structure with the efficiency of a body healing around a wound. The process so gradual and so complete that within 3 weeks of the empty coronation party, It was difficult to find in Harlem any physical evidence that the Cobras had ever existed. Denton watched this happen from his office on 130th Street, the space around him growing quieter each day as the organization he had built with such careful and patient investment revealed itself to be, in retrospect, a structure built on borrowed foundations. He ran the numbers in his head, the way his intelligence training had taught him to assess the causes of operational failure, and he kept arriving at the same conclusion, which was also the most uncomfortable conclusion, which was that he had been defeated not by a superior force or a better resourced opponent or a luckier set of circumstances, but by a more complete understanding of how the world actually worked. Johnson had not fought him. Johnson had simply understood the terrain better than he did, had known where the weight-bearing structures were before Denton had finished building, and had removed them with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this before, or something very much like it, in the long decades of a career that Denton had studied for 18 months without, in the end, truly understanding. It was this conclusion, arrived at in the cold quiet of a rapidly emptying office on a Tuesday morning in early April 1965, that drove Denton to make the decision that everyone who later heard about it described as either the bravest or the most desperate thing he had ever done. He closed the notebook in which he had been keeping his operational records. He put on his coat. He told his remaining assistant that he would be out for the afternoon and that he did not need to be accompanied. And then he walked 22 blocks south through Harlem to the barber shop on 116th Street, where, as his 18 months of research had documented, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson spent his Thursday afternoons. Johnson was in the barber's chair when Denton arrived, a white cloth draped across his shoulders, his eyes open and resting on the middle distance with the unhurried ease of a man entirely comfortable in his surroundings. The barber, a man named Henry, who had been cutting Johnson's hair for 15 years, looked up when Denton entered and then looked at Johnson, waiting for instruction. Johnson glanced at Denton briefly, then returned his gaze to the middle distance and said nothing. Denton sat down in the waiting chair across from Johnson, removed his hat, and set it on his knee. The shop was otherwise empty. The radio played softly in the corner. The afternoon light came through the front window at the low angle of early spring, falling across the floor in long, pale rectangles. For a full minute, neither man spoke. Then Denton said, with the directness of a man who had concluded that anything less than directness would be a waste of the time he had left, "Why didn't you come at me?" Johnson did not answer immediately. He allowed the barber to complete the section he was working on, the scissors moving with practiced ease around the curve of his ear. Then he said, in the even and conversational tone of a man discussing something entirely unremarkable, "Because I don't play chess by flipping the board. I play my moves, and I wait for the other man to run out of moves on his own." The simplicity of the answer was, in its way, more devastating than any elaboration would have been. It described, in 14 words, the complete strategic architecture of everything that had happened over the previous 3 weeks: the visits, the quiet conversations over tea, the 17 names written in a leather notebook past 2 in the morning. It was not a boast. It was not a threat. It was simply a description of how Bumpy Johnson understood the relationship between intelligence and power, patience and outcome, silence and speech. Denton sat with the answer for a long moment, turning it over, examining it with the same analytical attention he had brought to his study of Johnson over 18 months, and found that it contained nothing he could disagree with and nothing he had, in all that study, fully anticipated. He had no response. For the first time since he had arrived in Harlem with his maps and his research and his annotated copy of Machiavelli, Raymond Denton found himself in the presence of a question he could not answer, because the question was his own silence, and the silence said everything. But before he stood to leave, before he put his hat back on and walked out of the barber shop and back into the April afternoon. Denton looked at Johnson one more time and asked a question, a quieter question than the first, spoken in a lower register, carrying beneath its surface the particular weight of a man who has understood something important and wants to understand it completely. It was a question that Johnson answered in 4 words, and those 4 words, according to every person who eventually heard them repeated, were the ones that got written on the wall. The question Denton asked before he left was quieter than the first, spoken with the particular stillness of a man who has already accepted the answer before he hears it, who asks not because he expects to be surprised, but because he needs the thing said aloud in order to fully understand it. He looked at Johnson, who was watching the barber work in the mirror with the relaxed attention of someone who has nowhere else to be, and said, "If I had never challenged you, would you even know my name?" Johnson was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man searching for an answer, but the silence of a man allowing an answer to settle into its proper weight before releasing it. The barber's scissors moved softly in the afternoon quiet. The radio played something low and unhurried from the corner. Then Johnson looked at Denton's reflection in the mirror, not at Denton directly, but at the reflection, as though the question deserved to be answered at one remove, at the precise distance required for a man to see himself clearly, and said no, and that is exactly your problem. 4 words. The barber later told 3 people what he had heard that afternoon, and those 3 people told others. And within a month, the exchange had traveled through Harlem's network of conversation and retelling with the velocity that only genuinely true things achieve, because genuinely true things require no embellishment and lose nothing in the telling. Within a year, someone had written the 4 words on the wall of a bar on 118th Street in black paint, below a small portrait of Johnson that a local artist had painted from a newspaper photograph. The words remained on that wall for more than 2 decades, long after the bar had changed ownership twice and the neighborhood around it had been through its own cycles of decline and renewal. People who saw the words without knowing their origin sometimes asked about them, and the explanation when it was given correctly, with the full context of what had happened in March and April of 1965, always produced the same response, which was a long silence followed by a slow nod. The specific nod of a person who has just understood something they already knew, but had not yet found the right words for. Denton put his hat on, stood up, and walked out of the barber shop without another word. He walked north through Harlem for several blocks, then turned west, and kept walking until the streets around him were no longer the streets of the neighborhood he had spent 18 months studying with such focused and ultimately insufficient attention. That evening, he returned to his apartment on 131st Street, packed 2 bags with methodical efficiency, and by the following morning he was on a bus to Philadelphia. He never came back. In Philadelphia, Denton found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood near Fairmount Park, and, after 2 months of the kind of stillness that follows the complete collapse of a long-sustained ambition, he began working at a watch repair shop owned by an elderly man named Patterson, who needed an assistant with patient hands and a tolerance for precise and repetitive work. The skill was not new to Denton. His father had repaired watches and clocks in a small Baltimore shop for 30 years. And Denton had spent his childhood watching those hands move across tiny mechanisms with the careful and unhurried attention that the work required. He had learned the trade the way children learn things absorbed from the air around them without formal instruction, without conscious effort, simply by being present in the environment long enough. Within 6 months, he had bought out Patterson's lease and renamed the shop. Within 2 years, he had a small but steady clientele and a reputation for doing work that other shops turned away as too complicated or too time-consuming. He did not speak about Harlem to anyone in Philadelphia. He did not speak about the Cobras or Bumpy Johnson or the 3 weeks in the spring of 1965 that had ended everything he had spent 18 months building. He was, by all accounts of the people who knew him in Philadelphia during those years, a quiet and competent man who repaired watches with exceptional care and who occasionally, when the shop was empty and the afternoon light was long, would hold a particularly complicated mechanism up to the lamp and examine it with an expression that the people who saw it could not quite read, something between admiration and recognition, as though the object in his hands reminded him of something he had encountered before in a different context and had not fully understood until now. The Cobras, as an organization, ceased to exist on April 4th, 1965, 11 days after the empty coronation party at the gambling location on 125th Street. 11 days from the moment Denton's deadline expired to the moment the last functional element of his organization dissolved was, according to people in Harlem who had followed such things across many years and many cycles of ambition and failure, the shortest interval between a challenge to established power and the complete elimination of the challenger in the neighborhood's recorded history. There had been other challenges to Johnson's authority over the decades, and other challengers who had ended badly. But none had ended with the completeness and the speed that characterized the dissolution of the Cobras, and none had ended without at least some form of visible confrontation, some moment of direct conflict that could be pointed to as the decisive event. The Cobras simply stopped existing, and the most remarkable thing about how they stopped existing was that there was nothing remarkable to point to. No battle, no ultimatum fulfilled, no single morning when everything changed, just a gradual and total withdrawal of the conditions that had made the organization possible, until one day those conditions were entirely absent and the organization they had supported was entirely absent along with them. Not one shot was fired. Not one person was physically harmed. The entire episode, from the first poster on 125th Street to the last Cobra member quietly relocating out of Harlem, produced no incident that required a police report, no injury that required medical attention, no confrontation that any witness could describe in terms of direct violence. This fact, more than any other single element of what happened, was what people talked about when they talked about the spring of 1965 in Harlem. That a man had been challenged as publicly and as deliberately as Bumpy Johnson had been challenged, and had responded in a way that left no mark on anyone, no evidence of response, no moment that could be isolated and examined and used to build a counter-narrative. The challenge had simply dissolved, the way a sound dissolves in a large enough space, not absorbed by any single surface, but distributed across so many surfaces simultaneously that it loses coherence and becomes, finally, silence. Johnson never spoke about what happened publicly. He did not give interviews about it, did not reference it in any of the conversations that his associates later recalled, did not treat it as a story worth telling or a victory worth marking. Marcus Webb, who remained part of Johnson's organization until Johnson's death in 1968, and who spoke extensively about Johnson in the years following, told journalist David Halberstam that Johnson had mentioned the spring of 1965 precisely once in his presence, in passing, during a conversation about something else entirely. What Johnson said, according to Webb, was this: "The noise a man makes when he is trying to prove something tells you exactly how uncertain he is about the thing he is trying to prove." Webb said Johnson did not elaborate, did not identify who he was referring to, and moved on to the next subject without pausing. But Webb said he knew immediately what Johnson meant, and that the observation had stayed with him as one of the most precise descriptions of human behavior he had ever heard from anyone. The lesson that Harlem drew from what happened was not the lesson that most people, hearing the story for the first time, expected it to be. The lesson was not about the consequences of challenging powerful men, though those consequences had been clearly demonstrated. The lesson was about the nature of power itself, about the difference between power that announces itself and power that simply exists, between authority that requires constant performance and authority that requires nothing because it is already present in every room it has ever occupied. Bumpy Johnson had not needed to demonstrate his power in response to Denton's challenge because his power was not the kind that needed demonstration. It was structural, relational, historical, woven into the fabric of Harlem so completely that attacking it directly was like attacking the air. You could swing at it as hard as you wanted. Your fist would pass through empty space, and the air would simply close around the absence your fist had briefly created, unchanged and unaware. The hourglass that Denton had placed on the table at La Maison on the evening of March 17th was retrieved by one of Johnson's associates from the empty coronation party on March 24th. And it made its way, through a chain of hands that no one fully documented, to Johnson's desk on Edgecombe Avenue, where it sat for the remainder of his life. People who visited Johnson's study in the years between 1965 and his death described seeing it there, a plain glass hourglass, perhaps 10 inches tall, sitting on the corner of the desk beside the leather notebook where Johnson kept his accounts. No one who saw it there asked about it, or if they asked, Johnson did not explain. He simply kept it, in the place where a man keeps the objects that mean something to him, among the accumulated artifacts of a life spent understanding that the most important resource available to anyone, in any conflict, at any scale, is not strength or money or information or connections. Though all of those matter, it is time, the willingness to take as much of it as necessary, the understanding that the man who controls the pace of events controls the events themselves, the patience to let the other man's urgency become his undoing, to let the deadline he sets for you become the walls of the cage he builds for himself. Bumpy Johnson died in July 1968 of a heart attack, at 62 years old, in a restaurant in Harlem. He died in the neighborhood he had shaped and been shaped by across 4 decades, surrounded by people who had known him across many of those decades, in the manner of a man who had lived on his own terms so completely and for so long that even the manner of his ending reflected it. The hourglass on his desk was noted in the inventory of his belongings. No one who wrote the inventory knew what it meant, but the people who had been in Harlem in the spring of 1965 knew, and they kept knowing, and they kept telling. And the telling kept the meaning alive long after the objects and the people and the specific streets and rooms of that particular spring were gone. Because that is what genuine power does finally, when it is done with the noise and the strategy and the quiet architecture of its response. It becomes a story. And the story teaches something that the people who hear it recognize immediately, in the specific way that people recognize things they already know, but have not yet been given the right words for. That time belongs to the patient. That silence is a language. That the most dangerous response to a public challenge is sometimes no response at all. And that the man who understands this completely will never need to raise his voice, because the world will eventually go quiet around him on its own.